What should we talk about on today's webcast?
We should talk about how to build a conversational application and how to use Apigee to connect it to an existing enterprise system.
That sounds great.
I'm happy I could help.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
Goodbye. Welcome to the Apigee Up Close webcast. We do these twice a month. The topics are based on popular demand. You can sign up multiple times, and you can ask questions live. Hi, I'm Keith Danikant. I'm a solution architect with Apigee, which is part of Google Cloud Platform. So today we're going to talk about how to build a conversational application. How do you connect it to the back end using Apigee? And we're going to talk about what we're seeing other customers do with these types of applications in the field. And then we'll follow that up with questions and answers. So what are conversational applications and why are they interesting to us? Conversational application is something you'd converse with, something you'd have a conversation with. So a chatbot, either experienced through a website or over a messaging service, where you're sending text back and forth that you're typing. Or a smart assistant. So think about Google Assistant, Siri, Alexa, any of those, where we're going to speak to these things and have a conversation with them. There's a great case for conversational applications. 80% of customer interactions can be resolved by well-designed chatbots. 65 billion of potential savings chatbots could create. 60% of consumers say they want easier access to self-service solutions for customer service. And 50% of enterprises will be spending more per annum on bots and chatbots than on traditional mobile app development by 2021. So, great case for conversational applications. There's a diverse set of needs and use cases for these things. We might look at connecting businesses to their customers, controlling IoT devices, or connecting businesses to their employees. But there's a few challenges we're going to run into. So the first one is, how do you provide an intuitive user experience using natural language? A few years ago, if you would have talked to a chatbot, you would realize it's very scripted, and it's very limited in what it can do. If you follow the script exactly, you'll get a good experience. But if you go anywhere off of that script, it's simply not going to be able to complete the task. So we're going to look today at how we can make that much better, more intuitive. We're going to have a chatbot that can remember context and can be more conversant and be more like talking to a real person. After we've got that going, how are we going to connect that new experience to an existing enterprise system? There's an enterprise on the back end that has information that this chatbot needs to access. How do we do that? And how do we provide a great application developer experience? So if somebody else wants to build a chatbot or some other new kind of experience, how would we do that? So what are the parts of this solution? We're going to use Dialogflow today. Dialogflow is a product from Google Cloud Platform. It's going to let you build rich and natural conversations. It uses some of the Google Speech APIs, and it's great at building conversations that seem natural. So we'll dig into that and look at how it works. We've got an existing API for our demo today. Most folks are going to have some sort of service in place that's going to work for them, but it might have some limits. The one I'm working today is a RESTful service, but it requires authentication. It doesn't have any traffic management in there, so somebody could call it very frequently and bring down the system. There's also no caching in there, so we may run into performance problems. I'm going to fix all these things in my existing API, but you may run into some of these problems where your service just isn't quite ready for a conversational application to talk to it. And we'll talk about how to fix that and how to integrate that using Apigee Edge. So Apigee Edge in this case is going to be used to build an experience API. So we're going to build a specific API on top of an existing service that's designed just to drive our conversational application. So let's look at a quick demo. I've set up a Google Home Mini here in my office, and I'm going to have a conversation with it. Hey Google, talk to Demo Jim.
Sure, here's the test version of Demo Jim.
Hello, I'm the Demo Jim application.
What can you do?
You can ask me which classes are available on a day when a class is available, and you can ask me to sign you up for a class.
What classes are available on Friday?
Yoga, indoor cycling, kickboxing are available on Friday.
When is yoga offered?
Yoga is available on Friday at 9 a.m., 11 a.m., 6 p.m.
Sign me up for the 11 a.m. class.
You're signed up for yoga on Friday at 11 a.m.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
Goodbye. So let's look inside the demo and see how it was made. So the first tool we're going to use to build our conversational application is Dialogflow. Dialogflow is a product that's available through Google Cloud Platform, and we use it to build natural and rich conversational experiences. You can look at it on this website you see on the screen here. There's some great docs out there. I got started with this by running through the tutorials and then reading through some of the reference docs on the APIs. And it took me a day or two to get up to speed on it. It really wasn't too bad. So from there, you would head over to the console. That's where we're going to build things. So a few concepts in here. So let's think about what would a conversational application look like. So you go through a few screens on here to set up your project and things like that. It's everything that you would expect. The interesting part is when we start to specify intents. So people are going to say things and they have something in mind. They want to find out when a class is. They want to book a class. They want to order a pizza. Something like that. That's their intention. So we're going to have phrases in here that represent that intention. And from those phrases, we're going to pick out some parameters from what they say. I'd like a large pizza. I'd like to do yoga on Tuesday. So some of those are keywords and the other are just other things that inform the conversation. So we call those intents in here. So I've got a bunch of different intents in here that are specific to my application. So the first thing you heard me ask was what classes are offered on Friday? That matched this intention. And I'll dig into here and I'll show a little bit about what's going on in here. So for each intent, we're going to have a few things. We have an input context and we have an output context. And those are used to keep place of where we are in the conversation. So after we've done this, we want to record that somebody asked which classes were available and when. And that's a context for the application. So if I ask about Tuesday, it'll remember that I asked about Tuesday, and I don't have to say Tuesday every single time I ask a question of this thing. So that makes the conversation seem more natural. There's a 5-minute timer on here. So this will stay in context for 5 minutes. You can change that if you like. So the input context will figure out whether this phrase gets selected, whether this is going to match. This one doesn't require any in-text context, any input context, because this is one of the first things you would ask. Once we get further into the conversation, some of the later things, they'd have an input context that must be satisfied in order for them to match what the user is saying. So you have an input context, you have an output context, and then there are some training phrases. So you're going to type in here typical ways that somebody might ask for this. And it's going to, you notice there's a few things highlighted in here. These are specific keywords that it knows about. These are all things that represent time. So today, Wednesday, tomorrow, Monday, all of that will get mapped down to a specific date or time. That is where entities come in, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So there's a lot of built-in system entities that match normal things that would pop up in conversation. And then you can also define your own specific entities that are unique to the application you're building. So training phrases that use entities. And the next thing to look at in here is actions and parameters. So let's suppose somebody has asked, when is a class? In order to fulfill that and answer that question, we're going to need some things. We're going to have an action in here. This is describing what the action is. And then a number of parameters. So this gets sent off through a web request to Apigee Edge. And we need to send a few parameters in there in order to fulfill that request. So I need a date. When somebody asks which classes, I need to know when they're thinking about. Are they thinking about tomorrow or are they thinking about next week? So I need to pass a date in there. If they forget to specify that, they just say, when are the classes? I would ask them which date, and I'm going to prompt them for a little more information. And I can put a few different ways in here so this mixes it up and keeps it interesting. So if they forget to say which day, I'll ask them which day they're thinking about. If I'm not able to get a response for that, I might say, sorry, I'm not able to find which classes are available on date original. And that's going to match the date that they said. So $date would be a specific calendar date. $date original is how they said it, next Tuesday, for example. And down here, I've enabled a webhook call for this intent. So what that means is rather than answering it directly in here in this context, I'm going to call out to an external system, and it's going to send back a specific response that this can then use to give the person who answered this question an answer. There's a few things down here for fulfillment. How will we answer this? Do we have an answer right here? Like if they say thank you, we could say you're welcome, and we already know the answer for that. If we don't have the answer handy, we might use fulfillment for this, and we can enable a webhook to call for this. And then there's another option down here, enable webhook call for slot filling. Slot filling is when we want to ask a series of questions. What size shirt do you want? What color should it be? Where do you want it shipped? Things like that would be an example of slot filling. So I mentioned entities and that when we enter these training phrases, it'll automatically pick things out that it'll understand. You might have some business-specific things that aren't programmed into the system. So in my example, I have things that should be recognized as the names of classes that you could take at the gym. So over here under entities, I've created my own customized entity called class name, meaning, which class, yoga, kickboxing, things like that. If I click on that, we can see here's examples of what those classes are. And then there's also synonyms for that. So for indoor cycling, we might call that spinning or biking. For kickboxing, we might call it cardio boxing. So there's different ways to refer to this. This option up here, allow automated expansion, that's going to allow the AI that's built into the Google Speech APIs to help us out there. It knows some synonyms for these words, and it's going to help by filling that out and make this flow much better. So that's what entities look like. The next thing to look at in here is how do we do fulfillment? So fulfillment, we're going to specify a webhook in here. You have the option of doing a webhook, or you can do an inline editor and you can specify some cloud functions for Firebase in here. I'm going to focus on using a webhook for this, and I'm going to call Apigee Edge as my webhook. So I specify a URL, I can put some basic auth information in there, I can specify some headers. In this case, I'm going to specify an API key. So whenever somebody matches one of my intents in here, they ask any of these questions that I know how to answer, I'm going to go ahead and send a request over to Apigee Edge. And it has a specific format that's described in the Dialogflow APIs. So we've set up a fulfillment in order to call an API and send that payload over. Where do we go from here? So what I would typically do in here is I'm going to start testing my application. So I'm going to come back up to here, and I can just start typing in here. So what classes are open on Friday? And it's going to come back with its response in here. And we'll notice that it set an output context. And then we can come in here and we can say, show JSON. And there's the request that gets sent to our webhook. So what's in here is the action, some parameters that it collected from what I said on Friday, and what that got turned into, which was an actual date, and then the exact text that I asked. We see a response coming back from the back end. We see an array in there of classes, or I'm sorry, we see some text coming back in there and things like that. So this shows us what's going to get sent to the back end, and that's going to show us the answer that it got back. So I might continue my conversation here. When is yoga offered? So I didn't have to say Tuesday. It remembered Tuesday because in the output context here, I have Tuesday as a parameter. So it responded here with yoga is available on Friday at 9 a.m., 11 a.m., and 6 p.m. And we have two contexts here, and that's going to keep track of the context in the conversation. Let's just move around in here and have a conversation that flows naturally. So what do you do with it from here? How can you test this out? What can you do with it? Great UI, but how do we deploy it to an agent or a chatbot or something like that? So let's look over here under integrations, and then we can see some of the places that this can integrate. So once we've developed our Dialogflow application, we can deploy it on the Google Assistant, which is what I did. And then there's a lot of other options on here. Web demo, Facebook Messenger, Slack, Twitter, Twilio, a lot of different ways to deploy this and have your customers start interacting with it. Some of these have custom features you can use that are specific to that. You can return responses that are more rich for these platforms. So that's Dialogflow. Next thing to look at is how do we integrate with the backend service? So I've got a nice conversational front end here, but I don't really know how, I haven't shown you how we connect all that together. So the next thing to look at is how do we integrate this with the backend? How's that going to work? There's obviously a gym system on the back here that knows when classes are available and what time and things like that. How do we connect the two of them? So I've decided what it should look like on the front, what that front end user experience should be. Next thing to do is let's explore the back end and see what it's able to deliver to us. So what I've got here is a tool I use for testing REST interfaces. And what I'm going to do is explore the existing enterprise service that gives me the information I need to power that application. So I've got a few different things I can do in here. If I wanted to find out what classes are available, I call this URL, I specify a date, and I get back some JSON with the names of some classes in there. So good information, but it's not in the right format for that application to read it to me, set the right context, and respond in an appropriate way. So the next thing to do is to build an experience API. We're going to take what's in here and we're going to map it so that it's appropriate for the agent to talk to. And the way we're going to do that is with Apigee Edge. So what should the request and the response look like that we're going to send to Apigee? What are we going to get from the agent, and what do we need to return to it? Well, to figure that out, I went and read the documentation. So out here under the docs on Dialogflow in the reference section, I scrolled all the way down here to webhook reference. So we're interacting through a webhook. It sends a request and it gets a response back, and that response needs to be in the right format, and so does the request. So let's look at the request in here. Here's the doc showing what needs to be in there. So read through these and get an idea of what that looks like, and you'll have to click through here to follow the correct format for some of these parameters. The response that comes back has some text in it. It can have a message in there. You can put a payload in there. So there's a few different ways to do that. So that's our request and response, and this is how it's documented. So what do we do with this? How do we handle this thing when Apigee gets it? How do we turn the webhook request into something that's appropriate for the back end? The back end is expecting a simple REST call, but we're going to get a big payload in here, and we're going to have to decode that to figure out what to do. So out here in Apigee, I have built an API proxy to handle this, to translate the request that comes from the Dialogflow webhook and send it to the back end and then map the response back. So here's our back end. We're going to have different actions that come in there. So we might have a different suffix at the end. So this is my back end target. I put this in curly braces, and this is going to be figured out dynamically where I'm going to call and what URL I need to call in the back end. My back end is RESTful, and you put different things on the URL depending on whether you're trying to find out when a class is, or register for one, or look up something. So we need to change the end of that URL depending on what they've asked. And then there's our URL for talking to this. So once I come into here, we can see that I've done some things in here. I've built some things within Apigee to handle these kinds of requests. So within my pre-flow, I've got a verify API key in there. So I want to know who's calling me, which agent is it, who's the user of it, and things like that. The metadata that I get from an API key they pass along, when it's loaded through here, a bunch of variables get loaded, and I can use those to route this, to impose traffic limitations. I can put rate limiting on there. I can do anything I want based on who they are and the identity. So I want to know that, and that's why I asked for an API key. The spike arrest is going to protect my backend system. So if a million of these things start talking to me, I want to make sure my backend system doesn't get overwhelmed and it doesn't get brought down from all that traffic. So spike arrest will limit this to a reasonable amount of traffic. So in here, I'm going to remove some headers. So I've got some headers that are coming in, and I want to remove some of those things before I send them to the back end, because my back end doesn't need those headers and they're not appropriate to send back there. This next one's key, get action. So within my JSON payload that comes from the Dialogflow webhook, there's going to be embedded in there an action. There's a word in there that says action, and that's how I know which intent they've invoked, which one has matched. Are they asking for when the class is, or are they attempting to register for it? So first thing I want to do in here is I want to grab that action. The session helps me correlate which session I'm talking to, who's calling into me. So I'm going to grab that too. I want to keep some stats on how people use this. So one of the great things about Apigee Edge is you can collect analytics on your API traffic. So I want to map which types of things people are asking about, and that'll give me an idea of how to improve this over the future. So I'm going to collect a custom attribute in here. I'm going to collect agent action, and I'm going to save that for the analytics system, and I can build custom reports around that. My backend system requires a password, so I'm going to look that up in the key value map. I put the credentials in an encrypted key value map, and these are credentials I need to send the request to the backend system. The backend system has its own set of security, and it requires a service account with a username and password. This is going to construct that basic header for us. So it's a demo. We've got basic auth in here. Your backend system might be more elaborate. You might have OAuth tokens in there. You might be calling out to an identity management system or something like that. But simple example in here, you can go look up those credentials and put them in here. A lot of different ways to handle this. So this is the flow that gets called every time, no matter which action is invoked. But what's more interesting is, what do we do? What's the pattern inside of Apigee for responding to these types of things? So we're going to grab the action in here. And then what I've set up in here is I've set up some conditional flows. So depending on what they're asking, what that action is, there's different things I want to do with that. I'm going to call a different URL depending on what they're doing and route them over there. And I might take the response that comes back and format it in a different way. So let's look at the first example in here. So our preflow gets called unconditionally. These are all called conditionally. So if we look at the condition for these, we'll find that agent action equals find which classes, and that's going to invoke this one. So first thing we want to do when somebody asks find which classes are available, and that would match things like which classes are available on Friday, what's open on Friday, what's scheduled for Friday. Any of those things would cause this to get invoked. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get the date. What date did they ask for? And there's two dates to come across. One, the date original is on Friday. That's how they spoke it. And the date is what it mapped it to. So that might be a specific calendar date, but not the spoken words. And then we need to change the request. So every call to this is a post, but my backend system doesn't want a post. It wants a get because it's a more traditional RESTful interface. So I'm going to remap this request. I'm going to change the verb into a get, and I'm going to set some query parameters in here in the date. And then I'm going to assign a variable action suffix, and that's going to change the URL. So I'm changing the URL, I'm changing the verb, and then I'm adding a query parameter, and then I'm sending that on to the back end. So that's the request side of this. On the response side, I need to do a few things. I've got some custom JavaScript in here to convert that array of classes that come back into a sentence that could be read by a device. So custom JavaScript classes2string. I come down here to classes2string. What we see in here is I'm just going to iterate over that and make it a comma-separated list. So either it's going to say there's no classes on Friday, or it's going to take those things that are in the array, put them all into one sentence and separate them by commas so that the agent can read that to me or represent it in a more conversational way. Next things that happen is I'm going to build a response, and this is the response that's described over here in the documentation. So if we look at webhook response in here, it says this is how you need to respond, and then it has some descriptions of what those fields are in there. So that's what I've built up in here. So what we're doing in here is we're going to set the response type to application JSON. We're going to set the payload in here to fit that format. And then you'll see a bunch of things that are enclosed by these curly braces. Those are references to variables that exist in the Apogee context. So yoga, or these classes are available on Wednesday, for example. So that's what that's going to map to. And then we need to respond with an output context. Our output context in here is asked which classes when. And that shows up over in Dialogflow, and it tells it what state it's in. So we know that there's already a date because somebody has asked about it. And we want to pass back what that date is so it can be used in other places in Dialogflow, and we can refer to it and we can use it in other parts of the conversation. That informs our context for where we are in the conversation. So this is our response that goes back to Dialogflow. Let's do a trace and see what's going on in here in a little bit more detail. Talk to Demo Gym.
Okay, let's get the test version of Demo Gym.
Hello, I'm the Demo Gym application.
What classes are available on Friday?
Yoga, indoor cycling, kickboxing are available on Friday.
What time is kickboxing offered?
Kickboxing is available on Friday at 9 a.m., 11 a.m., 6 p.m.
Sign me up for the 6 p.m. class.
You're signed up for kickboxing on Friday at 6 p.m.
So here we can see that we saw a number of transactions flow through here with each thing that I said. So we can look at the request coming in here. We can see what that body looks like. We can see the policies that were applied and what happened along the way. And we'll notice that it was changed drastically on the way out. And now it's a RESTful call to the back end with a date stuck on the end of that URL. We see the response come back. It's a basic response from that back-end system. It's not in the right format to send back to the webhook. So we've got a little bit of JavaScript in there to change this list of things into a sentence with commas between those words. We see that applied in here, where we're going to build up that response and send it back. And then there's the actual response that's coming back to the agent inside of there. So that's what a trace would look like. And I use this to debug this when I got it wrong. And it helped me out. So we'll see the second call in there and then the third coming through. So this is how I would debug it, and this is how I get it so that it's just right and it's going to give the best experience. So that was the first flow where we're going to look at how we find which classes are available when we ask what classes are available on Friday. The next one is when we ask things like, when is cycling available? And it's going to give us the times for that. And remember that we asked about which day. So I'm going to move down to the next flow down here, and I'm going to look at the things that are specific to that intention and how we map that to the back end. So in this case, I want to get the name of the class. So I'm going to pull that out of the request, and I want to get the date. So what time is yoga available? And it's implied on Friday. And that'll be sent because the context from the previous question was saved, and Dialogflow will send over that context. So I have two things in here. I want to get the name of the class, and I want to get the date, both the calendar date and then the words they use to ask it. And I'm going to change the request into here too. So in this case, the backend system is looking for classes/class name, and that's going to be my RESTful backend. So I'm going to change this into a GET. I'm going to stick a date in there as a query parameter and change the URL around, and then send that to the backend. So in this case, it's going to give me back a list of times instead of dates. Similar thing with the JavaScript. I'm going to take, I've created times to strings here. And what that does is it takes a list of times, 9 a.m., 11 a.m., 6 p.m., and it's going to turn that into a comma-separated list of things that can be read by the agent. Once that's done, we're going to build the response for this one. So this is going to look very similar to the other one. We're going to set the payload in the response, and we're going to fill in things here. So this is the fulfillment text is what it's going to read. So we're going to say class name, yoga, is available Tuesday at 3 p.m., 5 p.m., and 6 p.m. And then we're going to set the context here to asked find class times so that Dialogflow can keep track of the state and figure out where we are in the conversation so it has context. And we'll return some parameters in there. We're going to give it some information so it can use that in the context of future requests that it's going to send us. So that's the basic pattern in here. And then register for class looks very similar. We're going to collect what we need out of the request. In this case, we're doing a post to the backend so we don't have to remap things too much. And we're simply putting in a body in there, and we're going to register somebody for the class. We'll get a confirmation number back when we register. And we don't read that confirmation number to somebody. We just give a basic response in here that says you're signed up for what class they are and which date and which time. So that's how we're going to build the flow in here. This pattern, basically the pattern that I've arrived at, and feel free to work on this. I found that it was helpful to have a pre-flow for things that should be happen no matter which intent is triggered and which one is sent across. And then conditional things in here based on the action that I pulled out. So depending on which action, we might have a custom set of things we're going to do in there. I didn't end up having anything in the post flow. So that's the basic pattern I followed in here, and that's how I built this up inside of Apigee. So hopefully that was helpful. So that was a look at what's behind the demo. Next up, let's talk about how people are using this. What are customers trying to build with this, and what types of challenges are they running into? So next we're going to talk to Kevin Ford. Kevin's a colleague of mine here at Apigee. Kevin has worked with a lot of Apigee customers trying to build conversational applications and integrate those in with their existing enterprise systems using Apigee. So Kevin, what are you seeing in the field? What kind of applications are customers building?
So I work with a lot of customers, and most of them, the majority of them, are looking at building consumer-facing apps to really engage their customers in a more meaningful way. And some of them are about cost reduction as well. So we have seen a lot of customers building support chatbots to handle a lot of the repetitive questions they get. For instance, can I reset my password? All of these kinds of things can be easily built into these types of conversational applications. Appointment booking systems are very popular. Being able to just talk to the connected speaker in your home or the device in your hand and book a yoga appointment with no friction. That's a really big one as well. So one of my customers is a utility company, and they created an app that allowed customers to set usage alerts. So they could, for instance, ask the system, hey, send me an alert when my weekly usage exceeds $20 or when my monthly usage is at $100, and then to get text messages reminding them when they've hit that threshold. So also, not quite as much, but we're starting to see an uptake in back office applications. It's a great way to distribute organizational knowledge. Think about, how can I get a badge replacement because I lost my badge, or connect me with the IT group to, provision a new PC because mine was just stolen. These kinds of things are excellent use cases for this platform. Go ahead.
So, do you think these things are driven more by providing a better user experience, or is it just people trying to save money on labor?
Well, there's a money-saving component to it, and that's a benefit that a lot of these companies do enjoy, but it's really all about engaging in a more meaningful way, especially if you're in a competitive market. It's one more way to interact with your customers and make that experience much more meaningful.
What types of challenges are you seeing with this? What are people struggling with when they try to build one of these things?
Well, it's a different kind of application and a different kind of experience. So what we see is first off, there are a lot of different APIs that you need to connect to make one of these experiences meaningful. You end up connecting to some of your existing back-end systems. You're leveraging third-party cloud services for directions, messaging, ticket management in the case of service requests. So as you start to bring all of those systems together, a lot of the cross-cutting concerns really come out into the forefront. So having something like Apigee in between the client and all those back-end systems really eases development. So you can do security once with the client, and then negotiate security with each of those different back-end services however you need to, and all of the other things that come along as far as managing traffic. So that's one of the big things. In addition, it's a different kind of app in the way that you need your APIs to respond. So we're talking about a text response that has to be spoken by a speaker sometimes, or maybe presented on a screen that has graphical capabilities. So you might send along a thumbnail image or a link to a page. Yeah, you might want to augment the response so it contains markup, so it sounds more natural, so it has pauses and inflections. These are all things that aren't normally done in your back-end systems. So having the ability to easily transform the request and the response is a big game changer for these kinds of applications.
I noticed when I was building this application, I started off with a real strict script, and it didn't sound natural at all. So then I kind of reworked it a bit to sound more conversational. And you're absolutely right that it's going to take some tuning. So when you write one of these things, you're going to have to work with it to make it sound more natural, to handle the ways people ask about things. I found I was speaking to it in a new way. I added that to my intents, and then it was more likely to get what I was saying. So I think over time, as you build one of these things, there'll be a tuning process to make it so that it's going to work as you need it to.
Sure, that's true. But what I will say too is as you play with the platform, you'll notice that Dialogflow does a really good job of expanding the things that you think to train it with. So you'll give it 4 or 5 phrases, and if you just try to use tangential phrases, 9 times out of 10 it gets it right, even without that additional context. But it's always helpful to give it as much data as possible.
Yeah, that's cool. That's going to make for a much better, more usable system. So Kevin, what's next? What do you think customers are going to build in the future? Where are they going to take this?
So recently, what I'm seeing is some more advanced kind of flows that bring a multimodal experience in. One of my customers is building a conversational app that allows their customers to order meal kits or fully prepared dinners. And sometimes it's totally fine to finish this as a voice flow. If you're ordering a pizza, that's pretty easy to do. We all know what it looks like. The expectation is there. But if there are 3 or 4 options, for a variety of different choices, you might want to see pictures. In addition,
I see.
You might, in the case where you're cooking at home, which is what this particular use case was, I might already have some of those ingredients. So that is a much more natural thing to do on a mobile app or a website. So what they did is they used Firebase as a real-time database, and as their customers are communicating with the speaker, they're starting the flow. They're expressing what they're interested in. And then at any point, they can just say, finish an app. And when they do that, they can move over to the app or the website, and that state is all automatically presented to them. They can go complete it. They can indicate that they already have 3 of these items at home. They don't need them.
Right, that's cool. So if they get beyond the capabilities of a voice interface, they can easily switch to something that's going to be more feature-rich.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
That's cool. Very good. Well, thanks for coming in and talking to us today, Kevin.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
So what can you do to get started with this? How can you start building your own conversational applications? Well, first, take a look at dialogflow.com. Go through the tutorials in there, read the docs, look at the documentation on the API specifically, and look at that JSON request that's sent and the response that needs to come back. Take a look at the blogs for data flow. There's some great articles in there about using context and what they are and how they work. Visit apogee.com. There's a ton of resources on apogee.com talking all about Apogee Edge, what you can do with it, what other customers done with it. You'll get some inspiration and learn a bit more about how to use the product. Community.apogee.com has a ton of resources on more technical aspects of Apogee. So there's a community out there of folks who answer and ask questions about Apogee. There's links to tutorials out there. There's links to e-learning and things like that. So take a look through that, and that'll give you more information about how to use Apogee. You can always look on YouTube and find a lot of information out there also. Okay, let's take some questions. So a few people asked, is it being recorded? Yeah, this session will be recorded. You'll be able to find it out on YouTube on the Apogee channel. What's the difference between a chatbot and a virtual assistant? So in this case, I would say a chatbot is purpose-built for a specific application, like book something at the gym. And a virtual assistant is multi-purpose. So I use the Google Assistant in here, which you could think of as a virtual assistant. And then it had an application running within it, which was the demo gym in this case. So they kind of cross over, and you can build applications that run within those virtual assistants, or you can run direct chatbots in Dialogflow and make them that way. Does the conversation continue until there's an agent action, or how is it handled if there is something that it can't handle? So when I was doing this, it took me a little while to get my head around context and what that is in here. So you saw in there, I had a few intents, and those were different things that people might ask. There is a context, there's an input context and an output context for each of those. So for some of them, you would specify an input context, and they won't be considered when somebody speaks to the agent unless a current context is active. And that will happen when you set an output context and it's still active. So what helped me understand this, because it is a new paradigm, a new way of thinking about things, look on the dialogflow.com blog. And out there's an article called How Context and Follow-Up Intents Work. And that explains it really well. I thought it was a great article, and it helped me to understand how this works. How do things flow within that structure? So how do you learn more about this? How can you get trained on Dialogflow and what to do with it? Go to dialogflow.com and look through all the examples out there. I believe there's some community support out there in different places too, and look through the blog. We have another question about context. How are they maintained in programs? So yeah, same answer. Take a look at that blog. I think it'll be very helpful. Can you personalize the voice? So yeah, you can. You can choose which voice is used, and that's going to be based on the platform. On Google Assistant, for example, I had a few different choices of voices. Can you use a single Dialogflow application to respond to different types of clients? So what if you had this on Google Assistant, you also had it on Slack, and it was running on Alexa? Yeah, you can use the same application for that. There is the ability in there to customize the response per device. So some devices might have a display, for example, and some are voice only. And you can customize what would be returned to each of those. Can it be integrated with Slack? Yes, Slack is one of the integrations that exist in Dialogflow. A lot of folks are using Slack. This would be a nice way to integrate with it. How does it change if someone's using Google Assistant on their phone? So if this is being experienced on a phone, we're going to have a more rich experience. You can return cards with answers. You could have hyperlinks and things like that. So it goes beyond voice, and you can do a lot more in there. Could it run on Amazon's Echo? Yes, it could. So yeah, a lot of different platforms supported. So I already have Apogee, and we have proxies in front of our backend services. If I introduce voice, it seems like I need to change my proxies so they'll respond in a way that will be natural for voice users. How can I do this? So yeah, great question. And thank you for using Apogee. You would introduce an experience API. So a lot of times if you're going to build like a mobile application or something like that, you might build an API that's suitable just for that. So you're going to take your existing services and you're going to use Apogee to map those answers and give it different kinds of responses that are going to happen for voice. What does it cost? I think Dialogflow is free of cost for 1,000 calls or less. Google offers enterprise support for it. So if you need an SLA, you need enterprise support on Dialogflow, that is offered through Google Cloud. What's a typical time for new developers learning Apogee to build production applications? So, it varies. It varies on what your background is. I would say to learn Apogee, a week or two probably is what I'm seeing with most folks who have a background and have built like a web service or something like that before. So there are some good tutorials out there. There's a nice in-depth one that takes about a week to go through, and after that, most folks are pretty proficient with it. How can Dialogflow and Apigee coexist in an on-premise infrastructure? Dialogflow is offered in the cloud. Apigee can be run on-premises or it can be run in the cloud. So you would have Apigee, listening to and responding to these answers in your on-premises solution. You would have to open up that particular call to the outside if you wanted to take a voice request. Another question here, can you integrate Google Calendar with Apigee API? Yes, you can. Google Calendar's got a great API. So most of the services that are available in Google have nice APIs. Take a look at those. You can add appointments to a calendar. You can remove them. You can check them, things like that. So yeah, integrating this with a calendar would be a really nice application. Question in here is, does the context get saved in Dialogflow when Apigee sends the response? Yes, it does. So you noticed in there that I had a response in there, and at the very end of a session URL, there was the name of a context, and then there were some parameters underneath that. So that context gets set in Dialogflow, and then those parameters are available to your application. So in my application, I didn't go into detail on this, but you'll notice I asked it what classes are available on Friday. And then the next time I asked, when is yoga available? It already knows Friday is the context. And the reason for that is I'm referencing that date from that output context of the first question I asked. So yes, that's one of the reasons we return those parameters in the context, is so that we can reference them in Dialogflow. Can I elaborate on the analytics? What can we do with the analytics in there? So yeah, inside of here, I grabbed the action that people are asking about. Apigee has a fantastic set of analytics in there. You can build custom reports, and you could look at traffic by action. You can look at what people are asking. You can look at what other APIs are being called, what the response time is, things like that. So the analytics system is typically used in Apigee to tune your API program. You'd look at different things in there and use that to really tune up that API program. So if you're interested in analytics, we're going to have another webinar coming up on that in a few weeks. Is there any inbuilt cache inside of Apigee? Yes, Apigee has an elaborate caching system. So there's a full-featured caching system in there where you can cache responses. You can programmatically access those caches. You can pre-populate them. You can invalidate them if the backend changes and things like that. It's a major feature that you might use with a system like this. So can we give any details on how the handoff from the voice UI to an app would be implemented if you're still in Dialogflow or if you switch to another platform? So a few ways to do that. I haven't worked with that too much. But I'm thinking you could return a URL and say, click here to continue. And then that URL would have some sort of session information that could be passed along to the other platform, or it could be a call out from Apigee that might set context in another system. So is that a custom application that Apigee app is talking to? Yeah, in this case, it's just a stubbed out sample application. So I have a REST-based backend that's a fake gym. You can ask for classes, you can pass in a date, it'll return a list of classes and things like that. There's a few more questions in here. We'll try and answer these, but we're running out of time, so I'm going to wrap up for today. All right, so thank you very much for attending today. Our next Apigee Up Close webcast is going to be on May 10th, and we're going to talk about how to measure and sell the success of your API program. How would you use analytics to measure what's going on in your API program? If this was interesting for you, or if you have questions about Apigee in general, schedule a one-on-one session, apigeeupclose@google.com. And for an in-depth tutorial, if you want to try this hands-on, we've got something called a virtual API jam, where you can walk through examples in Apigee, and our experts will show you how to build things like that. All the links are going to be in the resources section, and this will be available on YouTube in a few days. So thank you very much for attending, and we'll see you on the next webcast.